We've got a Cadillac today. This Cadillac has a bad starter. For those of you who never had to work on one of these before, starter is actually under the intake on a Northstar Cadillac. Kind of like the, I believe it's the V8 Nissan trucks, do the same thing. That being said, they were at least nice enough to make it an intake that is not particularly hard to get to. So, I need to pop the other end of this off, but this is our coolant vent line. We're going to leave it attached. We're just going to undo it over there and lay it off to the side. I've got my PCV lines disconnected already. That only takes a second. We are going to disconnect the fuel line here, and we are going to leave the fuel rail attached to the intake manifold, but we are going to go ahead and undo the wiring to it. I don't want to disturb any of the injector O-rings or anything like that, because that's going to open up problems later. Now, the throttle here stays in place. It's actually a boot right here behind the throttle, so the intake will just get unbolted, and we should be able to fish it right up out of there. So nothing too crazy, but I'm going to get a little bit of the stuff stripped out of the way, and then we'll hop back in here in a second. So we've got the intake off now. Just like I said, we kind of loosened it, tipped it up, and pulled it out. You're going to fight a little bit with the boot that goes onto the throttle, but as you guys see here, the throttle is part of that big bracket right there. Well, yes and no. Bolts into the other side, but this piece here is solid. If you see, this is actually your throttle body here. This piece bolts to it, and then you have your rubber coupler to your intake. Now, down here, you've got your wiring for like your knock sensors and stuff like that, but down here in the back of the valley is your starter. Now, there's two 10mm bolts here that are going to mount it to the back of the block. Once you get those loose, I take those off first. I kind of get the starter up out of here. Then you can get your wires off the back of it. It's not too terrible, but there is the inconvenience of you have to take the intake out to get to it. But that being said, at least they made it in a way where it's not too bad. This is all the tools I have out to do this. There's nothing special. You know, I think it's 7mm, 10mm, screwdriver, a pair of pliers, pry bars to help get the intake out, and then a fuel line disconnect might be the only tool you don't have sitting around already. So they're not horrible to do. I know a lot of people get intimidated when they find the location, but they've actually made it pretty decent to get to, considering. Got the bolts out of it. And it just comes out of there. So now we can get these two bolts off, or the nuts that are for the power and signal to the solenoid. And then we'll get this starter out of here. New starter is in there, bolted up. So next up here, we're going to clean these deck surfaces here really carefully. We don't want to get anything down into these runners. But once we get that cleaned out, we'll go ahead and get our new intake gaskets on the bottom of the intake. And the intake itself will get sat back down on top of the engine. So we got the old intake gaskets swapped out. These things, they're a little rubbery still, but compared to the new ones, these things are just hard. They're cracking as I was getting them pulled out of there. Intake is in though. So we got the boot set in place, but this boot is not tight. It's the wrong way on the zoom. There we go. So we're going to leave this loose until we get all of our bolts in and the intake tightened down. And then we will tighten that coupler up. But we want to, these will center themselves as we tighten up and get the intake sat where it needs to be. Once that's done, we'll go back and tighten up that boot, and then it's just going to be a reverse of everything else we did. We'll get the wiring harness laid back over and tied in. We'll reconnect our fuel line. We'll lay that coolant hose over and hook it back up. I'd say all in just over an hour to do this starter, which compared to some larger engine front wheel drive cars, really isn't that bad. Other than reinstalling the engine cover, this one should be done. So we're going to go hook the battery back up, and then we'll try to start it. It actually doesn't look the greatest. We're going to go ahead and clean that up real quick before we reinstall it. Everything under here looks good, sounds good. I don't really have any complaints at this point, so we're going to go ahead. We'll get the engine cover back on. I think we're ready to go. All in, this job is not actually that bad to do. If you're questioning it, as long as you have some abilities on stuff like this, I don't really think this is a job that your DIY person couldn't do at home. There's no crazy tools needed for it, nothing super special. It's a little time consuming and you definitely need a little bit of patience when you do it. But it's not that bad. I've done, you know, V8 starters in cars and stuff that are a lot worse than doing this starter right here. But we're gonna go ahead, give the customer a call, have them come pick their car up.